Welcome to Ratio Christi. This is our fourth week of discussing something. What was it again? Misconceptions about Christianity. So, yeah, this week is about heaven. And so I wanted to sort of raise the topic. What's interesting about the topic of heaven in American cultural life is that far more people believe in heaven than they do in God. And it's one of those things that in the turn of the century, as religious belief began to sort of decline a lot, interest in the afterlife did not. And so lots of books and articles and material have been published speculating about the afterlife. And what's interesting about that, I think, is that there remains this sort of fascination with what happens when we die. And there are extreme positions on those topics, people who've claimed to experience what happens when we die in near-death experiences. And there are studies done about the veracity of those, and neuroscientists are learning more and more about things about how the brain works, such that these near-death experiences maybe could be explained in terms of just brain activity, the kind of brain activity that happens before you die. And then there's on the other end of the spectrum, people like Stephen Hawking, who says that he regards the brain as something like a computer, and when it stops working and the components fail, that's it. And he says that any belief in an afterlife or heaven is just fairy stories for people who are afraid of the dark. So there's a range there, but most people have retained some kind of belief about that. Have you guys seen a show on NBC called The Good Place? Does anybody watch TV?
I've heard of it.
Oh, it's brilliant. Ted Danson and Kristen Bell, and the show opens with Kristen Bell opening her eyes, and she's sitting in this bureaucratic style. This is office with Ted Danson as the guy who's administrating, and she's like, "Whoa, where am I?" And there's on the chalkboard, it's like, "Don't worry, everything is fine." And there's this, description of what happens when we die, and he sort of says, your life is tallied according to points. It's always being observed, and there's points. And they have examples of things like that detract points, like using Facebook as a verb. You get a lot of points for being a vegan. You get a lot of points for never mentioning you're a vegan. So it's like talking about it all the time means you lose points. So there's all these ways of tracking, and so He says, most religions are somewhat right and somewhat wrong, but they have a picture on the wall of some adolescent in a jean jacket that says, once when this kid named Steve was getting high, listening to Pink Floyd records, he actually got it 92% right. And so they had his picture on the wall, and is totally brilliant. But I think this picture of heaven retains a kind of fascination as to the continuation of human life. Most people have some idea of life continuing based on, the credit you accrue with the things that you do on earth. And it's interesting too that in a modern era, there's a very capitalistic picture of heaven. So people kind of see it as their perfectly customized enjoyable, pleasurable life. And that is very, very different than a classical or an ancient sort of picture of what heaven was. So I want to really briefly, before we kind of launch into things about what is it in the Christian story, and then how do people attain to it or whatever, I'm interested in hearing maybe a few things from you as to what your pictures of heaven are, and what you think informs some of your own understanding of what heaven is. Just conceptually, even if you don't believe in it, what are we talking about?
I think it was like being in perfect communion with God without any of the limits of time or space that we experience now. Like, I was even discussing with someone, and he was saying, I think he made some joke about, waiting in line to talk to God in heaven, and I was like, I don't think
like Santa
that's
Claus.
a thing.
You get to sit on his lap. Well, that was the best 14 seconds of my whole life. Wow. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, I'll see you in 2,000 years.
Yeah, exactly.
It's mine again. We have all eternity to spend.
Right.
Yeah, sure. So that's interesting.
It sounds more like kids waiting to sit on Santa Claus.
Yeah, exactly. Any other conceptions you guys have of the idea of what we're talking about?
I kind of see it as a city, because in Revelation it's described as a city with all these jewels, and it's just sparkling.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a lot of people that I talk to, just as a pastor or whatever, talking to people who are struggling to take any of this stuff seriously, it's the opposite of a city. It's nature.
I see it as nature.
Right. It's like
It is both.
it's a very bucolic and very romantic and
C.S.
very
Lewis.
yeah. So
But
that's
if you
interesting.
think of Pilgrim's Progress.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. It's just it's not the usual thing I hear.
I get that a lot.
Yeah. She's not what I thought. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, I think that's it's both. It approaches something like the classical tradition, what I think Christians have believed about heaven, in that it is corporeal. It's not, a picture of pure sort of phantasm, globule substances floating like clouds or whatever. But I think the first thing to say about it is that for Christians, heaven is really not the end of the story. Heaven is the intermediate state between death and the consummation of all things. So in the Christian story, the arc of the Christian story, which is sort of told throughout these smaller stories in the Bible, but the large arc is one of God's creation, and then man's fall from his intended purpose, man and woman, and subsequently all of human society, and then God's promise to restore through the nation of Israel, and then the climax of the story in Jesus fulfilling all of these promises that God's made to restore the creation. And then in the final state, called the new creation, God says there is going to be, in this story arc, that he will restore heaven and earth to its original intended glory, to its original purposes for which it was created. And so heaven, is a word that some people have sort of thought, when I die, I'll go to heaven, as the kind of like my spirit will leave my body and I'll go to be with God. And that's, the Bible does say something about that. It says like two things about that. It's very seldomly spoken about. But the thing that is more often spoken about is resurrection, is a life that takes on, from the materials from which it was made, it takes on a sort of new and immortal form. So it's not reincarnation, so it's not a complete sort of reinvention of human persons and the world. It's the world built from the material that it was originally created, only perfected into glory or whatever. So in saying that heaven, that really the kingdom of God or the new creation or this consummated state is the end of the story, is just to say that in the Christian tradition, what it means to be taken up into heaven, it means to be to have the created world perfected in union with God. So the idea is that the created order in its fallenness is not united with God. It experiences a kind of failure to achieve the purposes for which it was made. And that in the end, at some point, God will bring the world into perfect union with himself. And that actually, you're right, is described, I think, most often as heaven actually coming to earth. Not us flying away to heaven, but heaven descending in a way that enfolds all of the created order into the presence of God. So it's interesting because in 1 Corinthians 15 and in Revelation 21 and 22, this description of the city coming to remake, creation, the created order, whatever, all the institutions and social practices and these things don't go away. They are just perfected. So that there are elements in this consummated order that are familiar to people who've lived their stories out on earth. So it's almost like you could run your fingers along the walls of this consummated state of heaven and recognize what you're feeling and seeing from the world's history that we just came through. In fact, the city that descends is almost described intentionally with features that you've seen from the story before. So there's a tree in the middle of it, you know, and it's like, where have I seen that before? Oh yeah, at the beginning where there was a tree to heal the nations, or you know, there was a tree of life, and now that tree is the tree that heals the nations of the world. And of course, these things are not literal descriptions; they're symbolic descriptions of God's consummation of all things, and that's sort of how Paul talks about resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, look, the stuff you do that is like the kingdom of God to come, where the poor no longer exist, but they are every belly is full, every crying eye is dried by the hands of God himself. All of these sorts of pictures of fulfillment. The degree to which we participate in that now, by feeding the poor, by doing life alongside nations of all tribes and tongues, so that we embrace each other as brothers. All of these things that are described in the life to come, those things are built from the life that we live now. So he says, your toil is not in vain, because we will rise from the dead. And that's another way of saying these projects that we engage on in the world today, which are undone as soon as we do them. So it's like, you know, you feed the poor, and they're still poor people. We've been doing this for a while, you know. You try to love and instruct the abuser as you counsel and love the abused, you know. But yet the world is still full of abusers and abused. And so the picture of resurrection is one where all that toil is taken up into the world that God makes, so that it's not wasted. It's not a waste of time. And so that's kind of the picture of future hope. And you know, this narrative arc, creation, fall, promise, redemption, new creation, is the story that Christians tell in order to make sense of their world. You know, just as kind of a side note, all people tell stories to make sense of their world. So there's a sociologist at University of North Carolina on Chapel Hill named Christian Smith, who kind of, using the work of Emil Durkheim, gives a theory for what human beings and all of their sociality are, how we work. And he says that human beings are all moral, believing, rational animals, basically. And he says, you know, in order for human beings to navigate the world, they need a social moral order. And what gives them a social moral order is some narrative that they tell about the world. And this narrative kind of, that they tell also that tells them, you know. This narrative defines the world in which they live to such a deep degree that all rationality takes place inside these stories we tell about our world. So he actually tells a story. He says, see if you can recognize this story. Again, this is not a story built from our inductive view of the world that we piece together and then come up with some true picture of the world. This is a story that we tell from which we make sense of all the pieces inside. So he says all human beings actually work deductively. They work inside of these stories. They don't build these stories from the world as they make observations. And he uses a lot of stuff from child development to show this is just factually true. We work with some story before we are able to observe the world. So he says, recognize this story. For most of human history, people have all lived in the darkness of ignorance and tradition, driven by fear, believing in superstitions, and priests and lords preyed on this ignorance, and life was wearisome and short. Ever so gradually, however, and often at great cost, inventive men have endeavored to better understand the natural world around them. Centuries of such inquiry eventually led to marvelous scientific revolutions that radically transformed our methods of understanding nature. What we now know as a result of that objective observation, empirical fact, and rational analysis. And with each passing decade, science reveals increasingly more about the earth, our bodies, and our minds. We've come to possess the power to transform nature and ourselves. We can fortify health, relieve suffering, prolong life. Science is close to understanding the secret of life, and maybe eternal life itself in transhumanism. Of course, forces of ignorance, and fear, and irrationality, and blind, stupid faith still threaten the progress of science, but they must be resisted at all costs, for unfettered science is our only hope for true enlightenment and happiness. That is a mythology. It is a story arc that has creation. This is how the world came into being. It has a kind of fall. Here's how we fell into the stupidity of superstition and religion. And then it has a kind of redemption story. Oh, look at the promise of science to free us from the fetters of, all of that blind superstition. And then it has a kind of eschatology, a kind of future picture of the redemption of all things, which of course is unlocked by science. So, and of course you can fill that in with American democracy or whatever. Capitalism. Now we can finally choose between Coke and Pepsi. Human life has been fulfilled. So, there's all kinds of stories that we tell to make sense of our world. And Christians tell this story. And they think it makes the most sense of the world. But the point of saying that is that, it would be easy to say, well, Christians tell this fanciful fairy tale story, but the rest of us deal with the dark, harsh realities of life. And that is what's known by, theologians as a bullshit. That is bullshit. That's everybody tells stories about the world from within which we rationalize about the world. And the point about that is to say that there's another person you might write down if you're thinking about morality. This narrative is where we construct our moral order. Alasdair MacIntyre is a moral philosopher, probably one of the most important moral philosophers of the 20th century, and he talks about how it is within this narrative arc that we make moral sense of our world. And his point about how people come to believe things about the world is that, look, all of us start with these stories and then we hold them up to criticism. But the point is, within these big stories we tell, we can all actually agree about the facts. We can agree about science. But just because we agree about science, that does not mean that we all agree on the story that we would tell. So Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, secular humanists can all agree on the basic deliverances of science, but tell this story very differently. Which is why I think atheists tend to be right when they saying I'm an atheist says almost nothing about me. It says what I don't believe. Now comes the hard part. What do I believe? And the point I'm making is whatever you believe, you have a story, and whatever that story is, you have an eschatology. You have a future hope. And this is the Christian future hope. It's this post-mortem continuation of corporeal human life in a resurrected state, and the only reason we believe it is because we think in the middle of history someone was actually resurrected, named Jesus Christ. And so that's kind of the shape of it. And I think that thinking about the rationality of that claim, you can go off in a lot of different directions that we can discuss in a moment about, well, what reason is there to believe that it's possible to have a resurrected life? And then we could get into reasons to think, what reasons do you think Jesus rose from the dead, since that's the main reason we believe in a resurrection. But we could also talk about, well, what is it about the world that would make you think human beings would continue to live past their physical state? That human life could continue beyond brain states. That's a big question. But one reason to think that might be true is that human beings seem to have ends to which this human life cannot fulfill. At least that's one of the hints that ancient thinkers so the trails that they followed to say there seems to be a transcendent aspect to human experience that human life itself does not explain, and that made them think that there was such thing as a soul. So Augustine says it like this, which I really, really love, and is part of my own conversion story to some degree. He said, your experience of the good is never a pure experience of the thing which is good, and that this is a clue. He in book 10, I think, of the Confessions, he says it this way. He says, but when I love you, God, what do I love? Is it not physical beauty, nor temporal glory, nor the brightness of light, dear to earthly eyes, nor the sweet melodies of all kinds of songs, nor the gentle odor of flowers and ointments and perfumes, nor manna or honey, nor limbs welcoming the embraces of the flesh? It is not these I love when I love my God. Yet there is a light I love, and a food I love, and a kind of embrace when I love my God. A light, a voice, an odor, a food, an embrace of my inner man where my soul is floodlit by light which space cannot contain, where there is sound that cannot seize in time, where there's a perfume that no breeze disperses, where there's a taste for food that no amount of eating can lessen, and when the bond of union that no satiety can part. That is what I love when I love my God. Which is brilliant. Which is saying there is a goodness in things that I apprehend and embrace that is not in those things. And if you want to say it in a dry form of moral philosophers, an analytic philosophy, which is to take poetry and squeeze it through a calculator. But people like Robert Adams, who's a moral philosopher, a contemporary moral philosopher, kind of reworking some of the stuff that G.E. Moore did in saying, why does it seem that naturalism isn't able to account for morality? Robert Adams says that take any natural property and try to identify the good. So give me an instance of the good, and if people who believe in moral facts, who believe that morality it can be found in nature, he's saying, show me the property that is moral goodness. And he says the fact is that it is always an open question. When you name any particular thing, you could ask of that thing, but is that really good? And that kicks the question down a line to say, well, if you can ask if that's really good, then what you just named is not an analytical identification of the moral property, of the good. And so he says, really, there's this sort of inability to nail down moral properties in nature that shows the goodness of things is always transcendent beyond and above the things we call good. And of course, in the Christian tradition, that goodness is just God. So this is the big misconception that people have in our capitalistic, consumeristic view of heaven, where it's like, oh, heaven is where I just get to name the pleasures that I enjoy. Those pleasures that we experience now are dim mirrors of the goodness of God, which the Christian tradition says you will be perfectly united with upon the resurrected life. And that means two things. It means moral goodness in this life is not just a reward that God's like, all right, cash in your chips. You helped that old lady? That's fantastic. That's 27 points. And then he rewards you. The classical picture of heaven is one in which the goodness that you do and experience now is a reward. It's the experience of God. And you will receive that reward in full upon being united with God. So that the reward is God himself, because God is the good himself. And the degree to which sex is deliciously good, that chocolate is good, that relationships are good, the degree to which those things are good, they are emanations of the goodness of a God that you are experiencing through these things that he sustains in creation. So heaven is just being united with the good. And so that's what so C.S. Lewis says. This is a little bit of a lengthy quote, but I think it's pretty awesome. So it says, people often think of Christian morality as a kind of bargain in which God says, if you keep a lot of rules, I'll reward you, and if you don't, I'll do the other thing. He says, I don't think that's the best way of looking at it. I would much rather say that every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all of your life long, you are slowly turning the central thing either into a heavenly thing that is more like God, as it embraces the good, or a hellish thing that is less like God, because it rejects the good. So he says, either one or the other. You're turning into somebody that has a taste for the state of war and hatred with God and fellow creatures, or to somebody that embraces joy and peace and rather than knowledge and power. And he says to be the other is madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness, and each of us at any moment is progressing to one state or the other. And that means each person is either moving closer to a union with God or moving further from union with God. And so that picture was accepted by and large by most of the ancient world. Christianity said, well, here's the deal. if each of us are moving more and more close or further away from perfect union with God through our embrace of the good, by our own lights, in our own sort of fumbling, because of our frailty, we will not embrace the perfect union with the good. Because we won't fulfill that trajectory at life's end. Alexander Solzhenitsyn has a brilliant meditation in his Princeton lectures on, Yale lectures on morality after his experience in the gulags. And he said, if only it were so simple, good and evil. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing all evil deeds, and it were necessary to separate the evil people from the rest of us and just destroy them. But the fact is, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. So we cannot wish for evil to be judged without wishing for ourselves to be judged. And so this is the fundamental problem Christianity states about why it is that people don't experience union with God, why it is that in the end people have set through the trajectory of their life, they won't embrace God. And so the Christian message is that the good actually made a pilgrimage to us. I mean, that's the heart of the Christian message. Instead of us making this pilgrimage to the good, where we kind of haltingly and falteringly, lunge and falter after it, the good became incarnate in Jesus Christ for God to make his way to us. So the good is something that God sort of says, the good is a person, and this person of perfect goodness will embrace us in our frailty. God united himself with human beings in this person, Jesus. So God makes this union with human beings in this person, God, or Jesus, who is God. And so Jesus becomes this sort of bridge. And this is how all the ancient church fathers talked about it. Jesus becomes the intersection of heaven and earth. He is the world tree on the cross, the axis mundi. He's the intersection of heaven and earth in a person who lives in perfect union with God, in perfect union with creation, in perfect union with himself. And by faith, Christians say you can unite to this man who is Jesus, who then unites you to God perfectly in the present by faith in him. And he's the one that will raise you from the dead in perfect union with God in the end, in his resurrection. So that's kind of the logic of heaven, or the new creation. And it's the hope that says, okay, why do we do good things on earth? Not to store up points to score in order for our own egoistic desire to have bliss. It's because we want the goodness in the kingdom to come now. That's why we embrace God in the faces of the poor, in the doing of good deeds. But of course, those things by itself would never amount to the perfect union with the good. And so God says, well, I'll send the good to you in the form of Jesus Christ, who is our hope and resurrection to turn the toil into the creation's perfect unity with God in the end. So anyway, that's a bit of a picture, I think, of it. And yeah, do you guys have any questions or comments about any of that? That rambling, steaming mess?
Really wish Marco was here for this one.
Oh, me too. But
You have to put that on the table.
Marco, where are you?
That is exactly why we're recording.
Yeah. And the thing is that, here's the thing. That picture leaves 7 million open questions about the metaphysics of human persons, about the continuity of human persons in resurrection, personal identity questions about how am I the same person in resurrection as I am beforehand. There's lots of questions that come out of that. But the essential picture of it, I think, has motivated Western history for the last, 2,000 years. And it's the reason why these social institutions in the Western world exist, that picture. It's the reason why the greatest poet in Western history, two of them, Milton and Dante, set the moral imagination for the world, for the Western world. This idea of pilgrimage. I woke and found myself in a dark wood, and every human life seeing themselves on some kind of pilgrimage so that your life isn't just a kind of disjointed mess until the point your eyes close for good, but that it's actually moving towards some intended end that is being drawn by some intended future. That's haunted Western imagination for the history of the world. And it's a beautiful vision. I think aesthetically it's gorgeous and motivating, but I think it also happens to be true, both because of the way that it defines the good in these broadly Platonic ways that I think are right, and it makes sense of our experience of the world, which is when you taste these good things in the world, you are experiencing more than just the finite created sort of fleeting goodnesses of these things. You are participating in something eternal and infinite when you taste these fleeting goods that are dimly reflected. I think that's experientially true, phenomenologically true. So, anyway.
Julia or Julia?
Both of those.
We never really
Both.
explained what Ratio Christi is, did we?
Oh, no. Risto, do you want to explain what Ratio Christi is?
Sorry.
I can explain.
What is it?
Well, basically, like Ratio Christi, it means from Latin reasons for Christ. And I don't know if have you heard of apologetics? Yeah, so it's apologetics, and then, yeah, so you know what apologetics is.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's an apologetic student group that, wants to create safe spaces for people to examine Christian faith.
So what's your faith background?
Is it still on?
Nope.
Okay. I don't particularly want to be recorded.
Oh, good. I thought you turned it